Thank you for coming to this session over the other one. We're going to make it worth your while. I have an amazing set of people here. Amazing in their own right, but also really complementary to each other, which you'll hear. So Patrick de Cambourg on the right here, I will let Patrick introduce himself more. But, the leadership roles at Mazars, and most recently, and very relevant to this topic, the leadership role in the EU on the preparation of the disclosure standards, the CSRD. I'm going to let you explain that, Patrick, in a minute. But a huge leader in this field, and particularly bringing that EU perspective in today. Paul Dickinson, who I learned from a podcast that he participates in, although I would say he's a real driver of it, called Outrage and Optimism, which if you haven't listened to it, I really encourage you to, because it's an excellent podcast, and he did not ask me to say this. But I learned from that recently, in fact, that he moonlights in, more than moonlights, he's very active in double glazing, as well as disclosure. So
we can actually double glaze this building. If anyone in the proprietors is listening, we have a special technique for listed buildings.
There you go, a special technique for listed buildings. But Paul is a founder of CDP, which, if you don't know of it, is one of the key NGOs in this area that has really, I think, led the charge on climate-related disclosure, and is one of the great forces behind the International Sustainability Standards Board that's been launched by the IFRS. So I'm going to let Paul bring that history of working on disclosure for a long time in relation to climate, but also water and biodiversity, but to bring the international perspective, because CDP has always been about international. Kristina Wyatt and I met first because she was at the SEC, and she was working on the rulemaking from the SEC on climate, is now at Persefoni, and again, I'll let Kristina introduce herself in a moment in more detail, but brings a brilliant combination, therefore, of the US regulatory perspective and now working at a really important new organization on the data side. So I'm thrilled to have her with us. And last but not least, we have Sacha Sadan. He's the UK man at the table. He is from the FCA, but he has more to him than that, because he used to work at LGIM, and I think is a brilliant combination of the investor experience coupled with a regulatory role now. So that's the people I have at the table, and we actually have quite a long time. We're going to have to catch up a bit because we started late, but we still have quite a long time together. And so we're going to take a moment now before we get into questions, just to let each panelist give a state of play. What's going on in their jurisdiction? As I said, Paul will speak more internationally. But if I start with Patrick and then we go to Kristina and then Sacha, I think what I'm really interested to understand is, what is the motivation behind the push on disclosure within your jurisdiction? What's the deeper motivation driving this? And then how has that affected the target audience for the disclosure and the scope of information that therefore matters in the different jurisdictions? So Patrick, should I come to you first?
Thank you very much, Clara. I come from a very strange jurisdiction. A jurisdiction that has decided to make it happen in terms of sustainability reporting. We are discussing about what we should be doing, and there is a truly international push towards what should be done. Now, in the EU, we have a piece of legislation, so people like or do not like, the idea of having one more regulation, but it's a fact of life. And the level of what I would like to share with you, I'm careful about the time, so I try to make it comply with Clara's instructions. So, I think I can give you the high-level description of what is happening in the EU. In the EU, there was a long debate at political level, which has reached a conclusion last month. I don't describe the intricacies of a political decision in the EU. It's complex. It ends at the level of an agreement in what is called a trilogue, i.e. the Commission, the Council, the governance, and the Parliament. So an agreement has been reached, and it is the so-called Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD. What is it creating? It's creating a mandatory regime of sustainability reporting for large entities in the EU. And large in the EU, you need to bear in mind that it's not so large, because the criteria for a large company is, if I take the number of employees, it's over and above 250 employees. So, you know, in the EU, we are talking about 50,000 or 55,000 reporting units, representing probably more than 50% of the added value or of the GDP. So, it's not, I would say, insignificant. This mandatory regime is to cover environment, social, and governance matters, ESG. So it's not one, it's not climate, climate is included, of course, but you have the other key topics of environment, such as biodiversity, water, pollution, circular economy. On the social side, you have the workforce, but also the workforce in the value chain, the affected communities, and the end users. And at governance level, you need to cover the general governance and business ethics. So it's a comprehensive coverage. Maybe a bit too ambitious. We have a big discussion in the EU at the moment about the depth of that reporting, because, you know, it's a big change for many reporters, even if we have an existing regulation called the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which goes back to 2014. By the way, you understand the change in terminology. We're moving from non-financial to sustainability, which I think is good, because, you know, we always said to the Commission, do not define what you want to do, but by what it is not. You know, non-financial is, you know, I'm not a non-woman, or, you know, so we need to define, I want to define things as sustainability. Then there is a very important point, which is, you can have a look at the draft directive, which will be published, which is already available, but it's a bit complex to navigate, but it will be published. You have drafts and modifications, amendments that the co-legislators have introduced. The key elements to bear in mind are that, one, you need to operate under the so-called double materiality. So it is impacts, the so-called inside-out relationship between the entity, planet, and people, but also, of course, the risks and opportunities, so the outside-in relationship between planet, people, and the entity. Of course, as compared to financial reporting, two very important nuances, I would say it's more than nuances to a certain extent. You have to report on your impacts, risks, and opportunities, not only on the perimeter of your operations as defined under financial reporting, the consolidated perimeter. You have to report also on the impacts in your value chain, upstream and downstream. As compared to financial reporting too, there is an emphasis on forward-looking information. Forward-looking information is not absent in financial reporting, but it's not the key driver. In sustainability reporting, important points such as transition plans, which were covered in the plenary session earlier, and are key. Because, you know, we are talking about long-term challenges. We are not talking about the short-term profitability only. We need to complement the visibility given by the businesses on their financial performance by the long-term factors that may affect their performance or that are creating impacts to people and planet. It will be audited. There has been a long discussion. It will be limited assurance to start with for a few years and moving to reasonable assurance as soon as the auditing standards have been refined. And it will be digital too. In other words, it has to be tagged, or we have to be able, preparers have to be able to tag this and put that under a digital format. So all in all, it's a big change. This is level one, what we call in the EU level one, i.e. the legislative level, law. What the law is saying is that we need a robust set of standards. You know, we cannot limit ourselves to the provisions at legislative level. It's not precise enough. So the directive is mandating EFRAG to elaborate standards. And we have been doing so between September 2020 and end of April 2022, starting with the preparatory work and then moving to the elaboration of draft standards called exposure drafts in the standard setting vocabulary, which are currently under consultation, under public consultation. At the same time, EFRAG modified its governance to create a second pillar because its key activity was working on financial reporting. So a new parallel leg of EFRAG has been created and a board called Sustainability Reporting Board and a technical expert group have been recruited. So, and this is a different approach from some other models. It's a multi-stakeholder approach. In other words, in the EU, people believe that the standards are better prepared if they are prepared by a variety, a full spectrum of stakeholders, going from preparers to auditors to civil society, NGOs, users, of course. So it's a bit complex sometimes because it is, of course, a lot of debate. But on the other hand, it creates a level of acceptability and accountability of the standards.
And can I jump in and ask you a question then about what is that deeper motivation in the EU politically that has led to we want multi-stakeholder? What do you think is driving that?
Well, there are two key motivations. First of all, there was a big political discussion. So you understand that we are under the umbrella of the CSRD. In other words, as a standard setter, since I'm a board member of EFRAG, we have to apply the law to start with. You know, we click our heels.
But what was the motivation for the
motivations? Twofold. The first one is, of course, a big emphasis on sustainable development, the Green Deal, etc. So you have a number of EU legislations that are creating a big push in the direction of sustainable economy, sustainable development, from an environmental perspective, but also from a social perspective. So the capitalism, the European capitalism, has a number of differences as compared to other areas, and this is a key point that has been discussed at political level. The other motivation is sustainable finance. Because, of course, the EU has created obligations for a number of financial market participants, but the data was not available. So the idea was to bring the elaboration of data under the CSRD and the standards, which are called ESRS, European Sustainability Reporting Standards, to give this responsibility to the preparers, their governance, with the control of the auditors, and create something, quote-unquote, similar, medium term, to what is organized for financial reporting. And therefore, we are introducing in our standards, probably, I don't know, but between 50 and 80 indicators that are needed by the financial market participants to fulfill their own obligations.
Under the Sustainable Finance Directive, that makes sense. I'm going to now take that perspective and juxtapose it with, I'm going to ask you to put your previous hat on, Kristina. Tell us about the state of play in the US, and also what is the driving reason behind the effort there?
Sure. Thank you, Clara. So as with Patrick's situation, the SEC is really bound by its statutory authority. And I went to the SEC on a special assignment after President Biden was elected at the request of then acting chair Allison Lee. And she brought in a few people to work specifically on climate. And I was one of those people, and it was her top priority, so no pressure there. But we came in and we're just focused on climate, really setting the stage for Gary Gensler, who had been nominated to be the chair of the SEC, but was still awaiting confirmation by the Senate. And Allison wanted to really get a good, to borrow your term, running start, to give him something to work with when he came in. And so we sat down and we looked at a blank piece of paper and tried to figure out, well, okay, good, what do we do? And so the first thing that we did was to talk to stakeholders. We talked to a lot of investors, we talked to a lot of companies, talked to a lot of financial institutions, industry groups, regulators from different jurisdictions, and a few themes came out that really directed us in starting to formulate what the rules might look like. One was from the investor community, which was our principal target audience, because the SEC is all about investor protection. So we'll talk about single materiality and double materiality, but that's a little bit of clue as to, our perspective is really on what information is important to investors. It's an outward in looking perspective. And so investors were saying, look, we really badly need to have rules to help us to get the information related to sustainability issues, and particularly climate, to help us to make investment decisions. We're not getting consistent, comparable, decision useful, reliable information from the companies that we're investing in, and we need that in order to properly factor climate into our investment decisions. So that was a very important voice, the investor voice. We also spoke with companies who naturally expressed some concern about what we might do with regard to the regulations, but they also expressed a need for clarity as to what they ought to be disclosing. This was back in the time where I guess we affectionately called it the alphabet soup. There were lots of different standards out there, from the CDSB, the SASB, the TCFD, the IIRC, CDP. I could go on. Shall I go on? And so it was really confusing, and issuers didn't really know with clarity what they ought to be disclosing. And as a result, of course, that didn't help investors to get the information that they needed. And so that helped to shape what our direction should be. And it happened that at the same time, I got to know Clara very well, because she was brilliantly working to drive the effort at the IFRS Foundation that was leading up to the formation of the International Sustainability Standards Board. And that it was also at a time when the members of the alphabet soup had come together and decided on effectively a prototype set of climate standards that they could agree on. So they were trying to drive this clarity, and then Clara really brilliantly shepherded this thing through the IFRS Foundation, got lots of input to massage this thing. And actually the SEC also was working closely with IOSCO and the other securities regulators to provide input on this prototype that potentially could form the baseline that, I'm just going to talk about you, Clara, that Clara would say they were going to affectionately offer up as a gift to the ISSB when it was formed. The ISSB, punchline on that, was formed at COP26 in November, which is a huge thing, because all of a sudden there was hope for standardization and a common path. And there was this prototype that was kind of gifted over to the ISSB that's now The ISSB has worked on it and has issued a consultation draft, which is now currently under consultation. You should all comment on it, that will result in the standards that are ultimately adopted. And this is all hugely important because it established a common direction of travel that could provide clarity for companies and give investors that consistent, comparable information that they needed. And the anchors of this prototype were ones that we really quite agreed with, and they were around greenhouse gas accounting as defined in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the protocol that defines scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which relate to your direct emissions, indirect emissions for purchased power, and other indirect emissions in your value chain upstream and downstream. And then it also borrowed very significantly from the TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is really a very well-adopted framework and a sufficiently flexible framework to help companies to think about their climate-related financial risks and opportunities and to talk about those in a way that would make sense for investors. So it's very much investor-focused, but a guide for companies in how to think about and talk about their climate-related financial risks and opportunities. And so out of all of this, lots and lots of meetings, lots of time with Clara, super fun. We had sort of a few guiding principles. One was investor protection. We wanted to try to get investors the information that they wanted, full stop. We wanted to try to move in the same direction as the international community, because having lots and lots of different standards around the world is not helpful to multinational companies. So this drive to convergence was a core operating principle. And then, not shockingly, we live in a litigious society in the United States, so we really wanted to try to draft something that would survive litigation. And so we really tried to stay within the lanes of what the Securities Act and the Exchange Act define as the parameters within which the SEC is authorized to adopt rules. And so those were our operating principles. And out of all of that, we worked hard and wrote a lot of words on paper that culminated in 500 plus pages in a proposal that came out in the spring. And I'll sort of tick through quickly. It touched on really 3 areas. One is greenhouse gas emissions. Then the proposal, by the way, is out, has gone through the consultation process. Thousands of comment letters were issued, and now the SEC is trying to work through those and will come out with final rules at some point here. But if I can synthesize 500 pages down into 3 bullet points, they are greenhouse gas emissions. So all companies, public reporting companies, would be required to disclose their scopes 1 and 2, so their direct and indirect emissions related to purchased electricity. And then larger companies, certain larger companies, would have to disclose their scope 3 emissions. And those larger companies would be ones that had identified scope 3 as material, or ones that had established carbon reduction goals that include scope 3. And then the second category is basically TCFD. This is the narrative discussion that tells investors what all this means to the company. How is the company thinking about its climate-related financial risks and opportunities? What's its governance? And there's quite a bit of detail into what that means in the proposal. What's its strategy? How is it evaluating its risk? How is it managing its risk? And then what are the metrics and targets that it's using to measure its performance? So we have greenhouse gas emissions, TCFD, and then there's also a piece in the financial statements that would require larger companies to include a note to the financial statements that discusses the financial impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on particular line items. So that's pretty much an overview of what the SEC proposal is and how we got here.
Thank you, Kristina. And so we've heard about the motivation of the Green Deal in the EU and sustainable finance and the driver. But I would note sustainable finance and say that is not necessarily the same thing as investor protection as conceived by the SEC, which I think is a really interesting nuance. And structurally, it's interesting that in the EU, Patrick, you can correct me if I get this wrong, but this does not sit under the SEC equivalent in the EU. It sits under the Commission. So that's really important, given the motivation.
No, I totally confirm. As I said, the scope is taking listed entities, but non-listed as well. It's a size criteria.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, I forgot to mention, listed SMEs below the thresholds are also in the scope, and the other ones will be encouraged to adopt a simplified system. Because, you know, that's what is this is what is called the trickle-down effect. By the way, a difference between the US and the EU, in the EU, all companies publish their financial statements. In the US, it's different. It's for listed entities. There are lots of regulations as regards the transparency and accountability, but for private businesses, it's different.
Yeah.
So in the EU, we are following the same logic, and SMEs are at risk of being captured by the trickle-down effect, i.e., if they are, you know, suppliers or customers in the value chain, they will be asked information, and also if they go to their banks or to investors, they will be asked information on their sustainability matters.
And so what you've heard from both Kristina and Patrick actually is there's different motivations for this in different jurisdictions, but at the content level, there's an awful lot of common ground in terms of the disclosures. And we're going to come on to that later because we want to talk about what do we do about that. It's a good thing, actually. But you've also heard this point on the boundaries being much broader than obviously financial accounting boundaries. You're looking at value chains. And most larger companies, and indeed a lot of SMEs these days, have value chains that extend across borders. And so I only say that coming out of these two comments because that's another reason why later on we need to talk about how we get to international consistency. Because in reality, most value chains are international. Now, Sacha, can I come to you and hear about what's behind the UK's push in this area and what's happening?
Hi everyone. When you get a slot at 5:15 on a hot day, you better keep it punchy. So I've been doing this investing in an asset owner for over 20 years. So I've been at the coalface, pardon the pun, but I literally have been. I've met all the companies. I know the chairs of the big companies. I've removed many of them. But I also produce products that have been there, that have had ESG on the labels and hopefully have stood the test of time. But it is blooming difficult. And there are lots of things, and I'm not going to go through the acronyms and the alphabet soup, but we need to come up with some practical steps to get going. The good news is I'm not ignored like I was 10 years ago. This is not the way we are now. This is mainstream. And of course, we can all moan that it's gone mainstream too quickly, like a teenager, and therefore it's overpromised a little bit, and we've got greenwashing and all the things that we know. But I'd rather be in the mainstream of the tent, worrying about where is that boundary of that. Our role, and the reason I took this role as a regulator, and I really thought it was an amazing opportunity. First of all, London is one of the biggest financial markets, but it isn't alone. It works very closely with the EU. It worked very closely with Kristina and many of your colleagues at the SEC. We're on the ISSB jurisdictional working group, and we're trying to make sure we all hold hands together and get there, because this is our chance. This is our chance to get some kind of standards. And if my dream is that someone wants to invest in a fund that pays their suppliers in 25 days, I want them to be able to get that data in any country in the world and use the same metrics. I purposely didn't use a climate example, but I can do that any day if you want. That is really important. Now, this chain, if you're going to sort this chain out, you have to look at all the parts. So, ESG ratings are a big part of that. And we mentioned last week, we put out our feedback, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, we are now going to regulate ESG ratings. And we've said that the feedback was great. Now we're going to work with the EU, who've already put out some great statements, IOSCO. So we're not going to come up with some random things, but many things that are important, because ratings are starting to allocate capital aggressively. And companies come to us and say, we don't understand how they got that rating, or we can't have the right to reply, or we can't see the methodology. So ESG ratings are one part. We've done the things already, like we were the first country to mandate TCFD for asset managers, asset owners, and now corporates. And we will be doing that with ISSB and other things as that comes through. Every company comes to us, or used to come to me as an investor and say, I'm going net zero, I'm going net zero. I said, can you give me your plan, please? So I loved Kate and the team on the net zero transition plan. I'm on the steer group with the economic secretary and the government. We're going to mandate those. But we're not going to do this on our own. We're working with Mary Shapiro and everyone else from GFANT so that hopefully these things can be used globally. And working with the EU Sustainability Plan, we want one set of net zero transition plans. I want to know who's accountable. I want to know if they're linked to their pay. What's their 2030 target? How much of their plan is offsets? I want that consistent everywhere. And we will mandate that very quickly. And we announced that at COP26 when the plan there, that we will take that forward. So those are some of the things that we're doing. Assurance. Already, some of this stuff is really material already, but it's not always assured by the auditors. People always used to say to me in my old job, employees are the most important asset. I'd go, well, first of all, why don't you pay them then? The wage that they can live on? Do you have share option schemes for them? What other things do you have? Why is the health and safety not good? And why is it not linked to some of the metrics? Because not all metrics have to be financial that are important, and that's something we're going to come back to. So I think that's very important. And then one of the other things that's really important, will come out in September, we've worked so hard on labelling. We've seen the SFDR, we've worked with the labelling regimes. It's good, and the disclosure is good, but we are the consumer regulator, and we have to protect the consumer, someone's money, someone's savings. And at the moment, everyone is out there talking about their products, but not always talking about them with KPIs, output, impact, and I think it's very important. So we want to make sure that our labelling system, which is coming out in September, takes that into account. Very important. Labelling doesn't mean divest. You can divest if you want, and I had many clients in my old job and many people, but it's about improving the system. And I use the example of when we worked very hard on gender diversity 12 years ago in the UK, we had 11.9% women on boards. We didn't just buy the 20 companies that had women on boards, you worked on all of the companies, and now we have 39% women on boards, and every company has a very significant data point. And I think it's important that we don't just divest and abdicate responsibility. This is about stewardship, this is about improvement, and this is not just about divest. So I think that's quite important. And then last but not least, we are the FCA. We regulate many of these global companies all over. And so I get the CEOs of some of the biggest banks that come in to see the FCA, and all of them have got things, or insurance companies, or asset managers, and they all say that they're gold standard. Well, now we're starting, because we have this team and everything else, to say, you don't look gold standard when it comes to your voting record, or you don't look gold standard when you say you're net zero, but you're still funding lots of other things. So we're embedding this in our supervisors, our authorisation, in our enforcement, so that we can really attack this at every level and make the system better for the end consumer who owns these companies, whether they're private or public. Thank you.
Thank you, Sacha. So Paul, last but not least, you are not a regulator. Last time I checked. But you have played a role in building one of the organisations that has allowed, I think, regulation to wrap its arm around this. And so if I just briefly explain that trajectory, I'd then love to ask you about, you've always thought international from the beginning, and so I want to ask about what drives that. So CDP, which Paul was a founder of, had an important initiative called the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. That was one of the initiatives, along with several others, SASB, in fact, all the acronyms that Kristina was listing off and everyone was wincing. There was an extraordinary act of leadership. They came together and said, actually, our mission is more important than our organisation, and we're willing to...
They were brought together.
They were brought together. I'm going to honour others, but yes, it was a lot of us working very hard, and some of the faces in this room I'm looking at were part of that too. But it was an extraordinary act of leadership, Paul, because when you see NGOs say mission is more important than organisation, and we're actually willing to consolidate efforts to make the right choice, it's a very powerful thing to watch. And it happened, and it enabled the IFRS to establish a board that had, as Kristina said, a running start. It had a whole load of existing experience from these initiatives that had said we're going to blend together. and help you make it, including their people. So it really is a running start. And Paul, I would love you to talk about, we've heard different jurisdictions, different motivations driving them to move, and regulation is necessarily jurisdictional. But we've also heard the term global companies and value chains used several times in the last 20 minutes. And that's the reality for the preparer of information and typically for the investor as well. Most investors will have assets that require you to have information that comes from many different jurisdictions to assess a whole portfolio. So that is the reality in practice. And that's always been your philosophy in CDP. Could you just talk about, where you think things stand right now, and from your perspective, why this kind of international push is so important?
Sure, thank you. And it's a bit of a personal story, but I want to start off with, just to say also I'm affiliated with, I'm a member of the Sustainability Advisory Board of Persefoni, a very cool company if you want to calculate your carbon. So look, I would like to point out that there's a difference between this alphabet soup, which is kind of drives us bonkers a little bit at CDP, because it's true that it needed to be sort of tamed and organized. CDP is a platform. We are a not-for-profit organization. We are 22 years old, and we're a platform where companies report data, particularly on climate change. So companies can report to their regulator or to the CDP platform. And it's very helpful if you think of just two platforms. Now, all of the alphabet soup is advising companies about what to put in their annual report, and then there's CDP. So just to help with a little bit of framing there. And thank you also to Tessa Tennant, our original founder chair before me, or our co-founder. I mean, just a little bit about the concept behind CDP, because it speaks to your point of internationalization. If you were going to redesign the Earth, you wouldn't design it like this. You wouldn't have little nations or some big nations and then these giant global corporations. It's a very bad way to organize the planet. I mean, if you count nations by their government income, which is not a bad way of describing a nation, then of the 100 largest economies in the world, you can guess what I'm about to say, only 30 of the 100 largest economies in the world actually are nations. The other 70 are corporations. And of course, as you go down the list, it's all corporations. So this absolutely gargantuan aggregation of power and resource in the modern corporation has changed everything. Governments, have spent thousands of years developing ministries and, the rule of law and that kind of thing. And corporations have been running the world for like 50 years. Basically, when Milton Friedman wrote that article in 1970, he might have been right. It was only 25 years since World War II. We were in a kind of ideological struggle with the communists, which caused our governments to be a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for, humane. And as a consequence of that, you could say that the government could handle it and business could just be business. But, then things changed, 50 years is a long time. It was a long time. Berlin Wall fell. Thatcher and Reagan didn't really have an ideology. They just sort of said, less regulation. And it's gone and gone and gone to the point where we have a concretization in our legal systems. Every time you kind of buy a product, particularly maybe a product that's dangerous, some of the money you pay is going to stop your politicians ever restricting the sale of that product. Checkmate. Like the EPA, just as the US unbelievably withdraws from Afghanistan and then turns into Afghanistan with Roe versus Wade. So the US EPA is now, not able to regulate. It's a bizarre situation. But if you think about this, and the final thing I'm just going to say about the lobbying and the control of government is that, the civil servants, there are more lobbyists in Brussels than there are civil servants. The registered lobbying in the US is greater than the cost of the whole Congress. Citizens United meant, in the words of Jeremy Grantham, that corporations could spend unlimited amounts without telling their shareholders what they were spending it on to control the Congress. So, we've got a very complicated situation here. And this caused myself, Tessa, and others who founded CDP, Paul Simpson, Jeremy Smith, to recognize that the corporation was at a sort of decision point and it needed to decide what it was and how it would play a role. CDP is in a certain sense just an Olympic stadium, and that's what it's been for a long time. And look how people bust themselves, every weekend, 7 days a week to try and get that little $700 bit of gold medal. So what does CDP do? We have authorities. That's why I was trying to make out like we were a regulator. We're a charity, right? But when CDP first was asked to report to ask companies to report. We represented 35 investors with $4 trillion US. Legal & General, Andy Banks was our first ever signatory. And, most of the large companies in the world reported to us, but it was quite primitive. Fast forward 19 years. Now get this, we've been in 19 annual cycles. There is the most enormous history book for my regulatory friends to dig deep into and see the evolution of this over 19 years. And we've been scoring for at least 12 years and giving people higher scores for external verification. So there's a whole market there. But the point I would make is that in 2021, which is our last completed cycle, 13,000 corporations reported into the CDP databases, and they represent about 60% of global emissions, about 65% of global market capitalization. Now, you don't hear much about us because that data is then sold to Bloomberg and MSCI and Standard & Poor's and all these other people, and it's inside all the environmental products. So we're a kind of Edgar, if you will, or a company's house for global environmental accounting, and we've been doing that, as I said, we're just in our 20th cycle. So what of that? I think TCFD's story is amazing, and this is, Clara, where your amazing work comes in. I mean, it was the World Economic Forum approached us in 2007 and said, let's get serious with the accountants. And I had the privilege to work with Lois Guthrie, we agreed, if we get the big four involved, we'll win. And so they developed the CDSB standards, which were great. And then, the genius of Mark Carney took all of this kind of NGO stuff, which everyone writes off and doesn't talk about and ignores, and stuck the imprimatur of government and the Financial Stability Board and the Bank of England on it, and bang! Well done, Mark Carney. TCFD is a huge, unqualified success. I'm pleased to say we helped to support it to some extent, but it's now essentially something that all regulators can either adopt or riff off. And of course, CDP redesigned itself around TCFD in 2018, so the 13,000 corporations reporting to us are essentially providing TCFD reports. So where does that take us? I do think we've had the privilege to be involved with amazing initiatives like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and we're involved in many of the net zero initiatives. As I said in the other room, I think that does lead to science-based policy and a need for it, for net zero policy, and we can come on to that later. But what is the future of CDP? Are you going to regulate us out of existence? I have become poor in 22 years working for charity. I couldn't be happier if you do. Okay. But I'm not holding my breath, and I'll tell you why. It's because the utility I think CDP delivers to the world is we are the mother of all regulatory impact assessment. You've got 80% of the S&P 500 reporting to CDP. It shouldn't be rocket science to say, right, come on, they've got to make that a law. And we have expanded 12 years ago with support from NBIM and others to water and then forests. So we have about more than 3,000 corporations reporting on water security, more than 1,000 reporting on drivers of deforestation. We see our future in terms of expanding to other environmental themes. CDP always finds it very difficult to have the resources to do anything. So we're not really preparing a social CDP. But Share Action's Workforce Disclosure Initiative is preparing a social CDP. So do please look at, if anybody interested in social information, a fantastic resource for you. Share Action's Workforce Disclosure Initiative, 173 companies reporting with 12.5 million employees. So look, I'll just conclude with the meta context. Yesterday was the hottest day ever that humans have experienced in this country. The children are on strike. There is this advertising campaign called Extreme Weather, and unfortunately the budget just increases year after year. I think that what CDP points towards is the ability for massive collaboration, learning systems, ecosystems to build up. I'm incredibly excited, for example, by Kate's work. I had the privilege to work with Kate for many, many years. To what degree can those best practice transition plans be fed into the CDP system, and how can we keep that dialogue? I mentioned that we represent investors now, I think, 650 with about 130 trillion. We also represent purchasing organizations to your supply chain. Purchasers with more than $5.5 trillion annual purchasing, and probably 10,000 of our 15,000 are reporting to their customers through us. And that ability to combine all of that data and provide a space for the regulators so we can then move forward again is important. I do think that this is a political meeting, but it's a new kind of politics, okay? This is not the party politics that it breaks our hearts on the television. This is politics with a small p. It's the public interest being served by, I say to my colleagues at CDP that we're international civil servants. I think there are many new kinds of international civil servants here. You know, what if the United Nations was an invitation, and what if we simply accepted? What if we said that it is our co-duty as investors, as corporations, to rise to this occasion, which we know we must? People ask what are the limitations of CDP. I've got to say funding. All of the two platforms, all the government ones are funded by the taxpayer. And unfortunately, on top of doing our work, and we wish we could do it better, we have to go off and hustle for the money. Probably about half comes from philanthropy, and I know Asifa here, our largest funder, and half comes from corporations. I'm going hoarse at the end of this long story, so I'm going to take a break there. But I hope that gives you an overview of kind of where a lot of this might have come from.
Well, and what's interesting, Paul, is that it never occurred to you not to be international.
Oh no, that's a very good point. We were at the very start, our original idea, Tessa and I thought UK investors could instruct UK corporations to reduce emissions, and a lawyer called James Cameron said, the UK does not exist as a separately identifiable entity. Anything you do has to be global. And that was the 4th of December 2000, but actually it was the best advice we'd ever had, which means we're not that famous in the UK, but I mean, you know, Angela Merkel spoke at our last launch last year, and the last 2 Japanese prime ministers speak at our launches, and we're big around the world.
Well, and this is a little crude as a summary, but I want to move into materiality. I'm going to skip data for a minute. We can come back to that if we have time, but I've been told we need to make the session shorter because it started late. And I want to get into materiality, but just to crudely summarize as we go into that, we've got, for really good reasons, the motivations in the EU that are leading to the EU creating standards within the EU for EU companies. We've got the SEC rulemaking in the US, incredibly keen to standardize with other jurisdictions, as you said, it's one of your principles, but nevertheless looking at rulemaking within the US. And then, Sacha, we've got, you know, the UK saying the UK is going to legislate, but you know, you're looking for standards that are produced as international standards that you can then bring into law. And of course, you've got CDP, who never actually, I mean, maybe you questioned it very quickly before you got shut down, but really this was international from day one. Right? And so I want to talk about materiality, but not in a sort of heated debate way, actually. Quite the opposite. I want the panelists to share with you, you know, how do we get to a system that makes sense, given the basic truths of corporations, including small companies when you look at value chains, having global footprints and therefore needing data from lots of different countries, and investors having global portfolios. How do we get to a system that actually works for consistency of data? We're going to come into that. But before we do, I want to conduct a thought experiment. And sadly, I probably won't be able to ask you all for your answers, but I'd like you just to think about it as we go into materiality. The exam question for you, which is very appropriate because the last time I was in this room, I was taking my undergraduate examinations, so I have trauma. And the exam question for you all today is, can you think of a significant impact on people or a natural resource that a company is having that is not relevant to an investor's decision about investing in that asset based on wanting to know about what the future looks like for that asset, the risks and opportunities that it faces? Can you think of an example of a significant impact that is not investor relevant? And the reason I wanted to say that, to get you thinking about that, is that we've heard the panelists talk about inside out and outside in. The inside out being the company's impacts on people and natural resources, and the outside in framing being, okay, but what do the people and natural resources mean for the company in terms of risks or opportunities? For those of us who've spent a lot of time with the data for our sins, and there's quite a lot of people in this room who've done that, a lot of the information, the actual disclosed information that would be considered outside in, that allows you to understand risks and opportunities, is information about the company's significant impacts on the inside out. And climate is the obvious example. Kristina was talking from the perspective of the SEC motivated purely by investor protection, full stop. That was her phrase. And yet you spoke about GHG emissions, scope 1, 2, 3. GHG emissions, scope 1, 2, 3 are significant impacts. And so I think that one of the things we need to reconcile here is there is this, you often read in the press, or I think it's sort of stirring up by the press sometimes, there's this divisiveness that's framed. You know, that one jurisdiction cares about double materiality, and that, you know, and then others will, you know, only care about what's relevant for investors, as though these are distinct sets of information. Now, maybe you came up with lots of examples of significant impacts that you don't think are investor relevant. But if you didn't, then that means there's quite a lot of overlap. We're going to do Q&A in 1 minute, unless it's really important.
It was merely to say that I think a lot hangs on your word significant. Because significant is going to get materiality because of the different perspectives.
Oh, so I'm glad you said that. So the point was, what do I mean by significant? And I was actually geekily using significant in the same way that the draft standards produced by EFRAG would use, and in the same way that GRI would use in its universal standard, which is a test of significance from the perspective of the stakeholder experiencing the impact. And Tim, I'm happy to be corrected as the former CEO of GRI, but that is the way in which I'm defining significant in that context. And as I said, maybe you came up with loads of examples, but if you didn't, you will appreciate why there is significant overlap in terms of information that we need disclosed to meet investor needs and information that is needed to meet the needs of all stakeholders, the Green Deal, sustainable finance. And so because there's such significant overlap, companies and investors, but particularly companies preparing the information, want to know how regulators are going to coordinate so that they don't have similar but not the same requirements. And they're faced with many, many jurisdictional types of reporting. And so that is a real risk right now. It continues to be of concern. And one of the reasons why the IFRS move to set up its International Sustainability Standards Board was so welcomed was because its mandate is to provide international standards that regulators could then choose to adopt and build on, but at least it would provide a common baseline for different jurisdictions. So I would like to go to each panelist in turn, and I would love to ask you in that context, not to sort of defend one view of materiality, but rather to say, you care about corporate disclosure, corporates are global in footprint, how can we get to an ideal system that solves for this? And if I could ask you to reflect on it, but then say, what do you think is the single biggest challenge preventing this from being an easy conversation right now? Patrick, I'm going to come to you first.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to say that at EFRAG, we have established lines of communication with all other key initiatives, because I explained the jurisdictional approach, but there is a full consciousness of the need to converge or be compatible or equivalent, you call it the way you want, but that, you know, many challenges are global, many reporting entities are global, and we need more, we need harmonization to the maximum extent possible. By the way, it is stated in the CSRD, Articles 29B and C, and Recital 37, to make sure that nobody forgets. So, it is a key point. Now, the speed is different, and that's one of the difficulties. When we drafted the exposure drafts, which are going to be improved following the public consultation, I also encourage people to answer the public consultation, please. We have taken great care to have a look at what was being done elsewhere. GRI, the exposure draft or the working paper that had been produced by the ISSB or the TRWG before that. We assess, of course, the scope is different. GRI is focusing on impacts, broad spectrum. ISSB at the moment has a generic S1 standard, which is explaining what the sustainability reporting can be. And it's good, there are good principles from an investor perspective. And then you have S2 on climate, which is the equivalent roughly of our E1, ESRS E1, Environment 1. When we drafted that, we were very careful to make sure that we would avoid multiple reportings for reporters, because we wanted to be sure that someone complying with ESRS would be complying also with S2 or S1. Of course, you know, climate under the EU definition represent, I don't know, I don't want to please don't quote me on a percentage, but it's only an element of the matters that have to be covered. But on this one, we wanted to be as close as possible. And there is a dialogue. There was a statement of cooperation with GRI. There was a constant dialogue with the ISSB. So I'm optimistic. Of course, it's not easy. Okay, that's fine, but it's not a problem as long as you are willing parties. Now, to go back to we are on academic grounds here. So I think it's very important not to have a political battle, but to go back to basics in terms of, what does materiality mean? To your question, my personal answer is probably all impacts have an element of financial materiality in them. And it's very difficult in my experience to say, I discard this one because it's not financially material. We can rely sometimes on market consensus because you ask a number of investors. But, if we had asked the question 15 years ago about climate, what would have been the answer? So we need, of course, the support of market perception. I could quote two very interesting Harvard research papers on this, which we have, of course, consulted, where you see the dynamic materiality, moving from an impact to, etc. I also think that starting from an impact perspective, then adding the impacts of other entities which are affecting you, is possibly the way forward, but it would be for academics to help us on this one. I was surprised not to see that much academic literature. And being on academic grounds, if I missed something, please tell me, because I would like really to have the support of academics to move forward on the relationship between impact and financial risks. And there is always the element that catches all, reputational risk. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, a minor problem with, forced labor or child labor, if it's coming in the press, yeah, boom, it becomes immediately financially material. So for me, it's pretty difficult. I encourage all of us, all initiatives, to try to focus on this one and try to agree on a. And by the way, sorry, I'm long-winded, but when you have a look at S2 on climate, what do you see? You see 80% of impact and 20% of financial risk. So it is anti-CFD. Like that. Absolutely. So it means, and you alluded to that, Paul. So it is clear that when you get down to the issue, you start with impacts.
Yep. So internally, companies have to collect data on all significant impacts using the definition of significant that I gave in order to determine what is investor relevant information anyway. So that practice internally is happening. And it arises from that practice, the reporting that companies do. That I would love now to turn, I'm going to come to you actually, Paul, for the last word, and we're going to not talk about disclosure for a moment as we close the panel. But Patrick, what I heard from you is actually perhaps the greatest challenge is a lack of academic literature, which I'm going to say very loudly, given where we are. Because Patrick was referring to some work that has been done out of the US George Seraphim did a paper, and it was actually quite a long time ago, but they were looking at drivers of when an impact becomes financially material. And it, to your point, it was reputation, it was stakeholder pressure, which has exploded with social media, and it was a whole variety of different levers that they were looking at. But there needs to be a lot more work done on that, I think. Kristina, can I ask for your view from the US perspective on, it's not going to be perfect, but what would be an optimal system to get to the goal of international consistency?
I actually don't think that, at least as to climate, because we're fairly far along the spectrum from not material along dynamic materiality to materiality, I don't think there's much of a difference between single materiality and double materiality. In the EU, you might talk about impacts. In the US, you might say, well, I'm going to do a TCFD assessment, and I'm going to think about transition risks. Well, what are transition risks? They're risks, they're financial risks that a company has due to the whole host of pressures that Patrick and Clara were talking about, and it could be reputational, it could be your employees, your business partners, your banks, your investors, right? It's the whole host of people who are driving your business who are causing you to incur additional costs related to your carbon emissions. And so I think whether you take an outside in, like the TCFD approach, and you think about transition risks, what's the risk to my company of being a heavy emitter? If I'm an oil and gas company, does that carry risks? Yes, right? That would be the outside in US kind of version. If you take the inside out perspective and think about, well, what's my impact on society? I actually think you get to quite the same place. The key is you have to use the same measuring stick, which is where the greenhouse gas protocol is critical, right? It's like using the same currency or the same language. And as long as we're using the greenhouse gas protocol and we're measuring those emissions in the same way, it doesn't matter whether you're using an outside in or an inside out lens. And I will tell you, the reason that I went to a software firm is because doing carbon accounting the way that it's been done is really hard. It's really cumbersome. We're talking about millions of data points that have to be used properly to create emissions disclosures that are reliable, that can be audited, that can be traced back to their source, that can be used by companies, by their boards, by their business units. And that process is really hard the way it's been done on spreadsheets and with consultants. And what we need to do is to apply software to make that process easier and faster so that we can get into our supply chains, wherever they are around the world, and get a unified view of what our emissions are and what those impacts are throughout your value chain. And then we'll start to see capital flowing in the right direction to solutions, to companies that are really taking these risks and opportunities and impacts seriously and making a difference rather than just throwing stuff out there that might not be reliable. We've got to have reliability, have to have auditability, and we have to use the right software, frankly, to be able to create that view of your data so that it can be used properly.
Thank you. And so you use the GHG protocol as an illustration. And I'm going to say really honestly, we don't have a GHG protocol equivalent for many of the other issues that would fall under ESG. And we should just call that out because I think, you know, and maybe Sacha, I'll come to you in this spirit. The UK's decision to say we want to onboard international standards into local regulation presumably is because you recognize that and you think that an international standard setting effort might be able to get us to those common measures, to use Kristina's framing?
Quite a lot of reasons. The first one is don't let perfection get in the way with doing something. And if we all want to come out with our own golden standards, we'll still be here in 5-10 years' time. And we can't wait. Secondly, there's already quite a few metrics out there. So you mentioned child labour. We talked about that many years ago from an asset owner perspective, or tax. And we did in the mining sector get the extractive industry tax initiative, and we ended up getting disclosure of tax in the regions that you work, so that you knew that the coal mine, and it was a coal mine, but it was a coal mine that was fine at the time because we weren't into climate. But if it wasn't paying tax in a region, then funnily enough, guess what happened when the next government came into that country? They took away the licence to operate, and it was worth zero. It was material, but we didn't know it was material until it wasn't material. And I think that's the kind of thing we want. So what we want is one single set of metrics. There are already quite a few out there already that are pretty good. Of course they could be better, but we want that. One single set of metrics internationally. I've mentioned it on supply chain or health and safety or something like that. Ethnicity, diversity, come on. We should be doing this now. People want to invest their money on diversity funds. So that comes back to dynamic materiality. People will, once they've got that data, and I will think that once we get some of that data, we'll get more academic evidence. So there was a perfectly very good study, it was the London Business School, I think, so if that's allowed to say that here, on the best places to work in America. And that study's been going for 20 years, and that cohort, statistically significant, peer-reviewed, everything else, outperforms the index even today. So I want more of that, and I'm like you, I want more of that data so we can prove that these things are important, but we can't wait just for important. The second thing I want as a consumer and owner of these companies, whether it's private, public, private equity, debt, I want to be able to have one set of accounts that I can look at between. I don't want two different standards in different... Now, of course, I'm very happy that some people want to go faster. That's great. But the user of accounts needs one set of accounts so it can look at an oil and gas company in this region, an oil and gas company in this region, and go, which ones? Because hopefully we can then reduce the cost of capital, the one with a good transition plan, and we can increase the cost of capital, the one with a poor transition plan. So that's the second thing I want. And then thirdly, I know we have to help this system, because all of this stuff is great in this room, but you go and talk to a corporate trying to manage this. Give them a case study. Let's give them some worked examples, and we are working with EFRAG and the ISSB to say, how does it actually work in an oil and gas company? And it's not that different, this single double material. What is material? How do you produce it? And you're a multi-global firm. How does it work to produce this? So I think we need, as an industry, have to help bring some case studies soon so that these things actually get done. And I think we can do this, and there is willing, and I think this is what we need to do now.
And Sacha, and you're right, that there are a lot of metrics, but is Bob Eccles in this room? Oh, there you are. A wise man called Bob Eccles once said to me, remember, Clara, that standards are a social construct. And I thought about that every day, actually, because there are a lot of measures, Sacha, you're right. But what matters is that we all agree on the same one.
No, I think I would also say as well, so very important, people didn't always care about gender diversity, but then they do, and I want to be able to allow the end consumer, the electorate, and it is the electorate, the same person, to eventually put their money where they want to put that money. And at the moment, they don't feel that they can do that. And I think that's for lots of reasons, and not always data points. Sometimes it's data points, but some of it is because there's confusion, or people aren't producing it because it's voluntary standards only. So I think the money will move. And once the money moves, then we start getting the new stuff. And it's not just green, it can be many other things. And I think if we wait for perfect standards, though, we are going to be waiting for quite a long time.
And so, Paul, I wanted to comment on the fact that the protocol is not a disclosure standard, it's a measure, right? And the reason why that's very powerful is it's one everyone agrees on. And actually, you talked about the continuing role of CDP, even though now everyone's doing disclosure. You know, one of the things that CDP's done very well is it's gone to that frontier, and it's built agreement around measures when they're not yet disclosure standards. And we're going to continue needing that in order to reach the kind of consistency that you've heard the panelists say is ideal, but requires them all to cooperate together. And so you have the last word before we take a few questions, if there are any, because I would love you to talk about why this conversation has been interesting and important, but it's seriously not enough. And that disclosure, which has had a huge push in these recent years, and is just a wonderful thing to see, but as a result, people have piled onto disclosure, I think, all kinds of expectations about what it can and cannot do. And so I would love you just to reflect at the end on what else we need from regulation to actually change the world.
Well, thank you. And I mean, it's been a sort of, a long time that I've been doing this kind of thing. And it's very weird, when we began, we couldn't even say that climate change was real. That was too controversial. We had to say actions in response to the perception of climate change were provable. And then, basically nobody's paid any attention to this for decades. I remember about 10 years ago, I was with a big US bank, and I said, what if you just, did something green and tried to sell it? Don't you think? And we got no client demand. I was like, all right, then, fine. Anyway, now suddenly it's gone whipsawed completely the other way. I think extreme weather, and I've got to tell you, the children being on strike, it's not a good look, In future generations are going to be, really, the children went on strike? Did the children go on strike? So, in that context, suddenly it whipsaws the other way, and everybody's got total, max green product. And so I want to just take your kind offer to talk about what I'm going to call ESG endgame, which has got to be an appealing prospect. I mean, in a certain sense, we're going to be dealing with sustainability forever, because sustainability is problems the government can't fix. And now we've got lots of big problems, we're going to be dealing with sustainability forever. But what I call the ESG endgame, one of the most heartbreaking things for me, I think, in the last 20 years has been, I picked one company, American Electric Power. I happen to know they reported 150 million tons CO2 to us, scope 1 and 2, in 2002. Last year I checked, it was 137 million tons, so it's gone down a bit, but basically 100 and quite a lot of million tons. Every single year for the last 19 years, is that millions multiplied by $0 equals $0. And people say, oh, we've got to get better information. I'm like, darling, there's nothing wrong with information. The problem is, it's not costing anything to emit. So I think ESG endgame is where we recognize, first of all, we need to kind of account for carbon, because it's pretty serious. And by the way, every single ton of carbon in the EU ETS is fully audited and in the accounts, because it's €90 a ton. When there's a price for something, it sure gets accounted for. I think we need to consider that the next stage is, and I'm just going to use climate change, but we could have long conversations about other things. We have to come together as a movement, and we have to organize for the taxation and regulation of greenhouse gas emissions to get them out of our economies. Otherwise, we die. But that will justify entirely the accounting that we've been doing for the previous years, and you get a virtuous circle.
And I think that's right, and Kristina made that observation, actually, as we were sitting down for the panel, that taxation, ultimately, pricing externalities, is a way to have this whole conversation evaporate. But we won't get to pricing of externalities unless we have disclosure. So we need all of this. And what I'm hearing from the panelists, in part, is be patient. People are coordinating from a jurisdictional perspective, that we have to recognize that this pursuit of international consistency is partly going to come through jurisdictional leadership and a willingness to talk to each other and get to measures that are consistent. So I'm going to open up the floor. I was told that we had to stop at 6, but we weren't the reason it started late, so I'm going to go over time. Questions from the audience? Lady at the front here.
Thank you. I'm Sharifa from Malaysia, and I come from an entity that's predominantly owned by the sovereign. We're listed as well, and our listing regulations are largely based on the GRI. So this year, we made the first attempt to disclose more information in our sustainability statement. Now, as we started collecting the information, a lot of the information came out on this S factor. The HR department became very scared to disclose. Like, it actually showed that women were paid less than men. Okay, so there was pushback. And then we got through some of the information, a lot more than what we did last year. And then just before the AGM, the minority shareholder group picked up on a lot of the information that we disclosed. For example, why did you have a huge turnover rate? And so my question then is this going to deter companies from actually disclosing information? I think I'm going to have trouble getting information out for next year's sustainability statement. Thank you.
Who would like to take that question?
The tiny comment is the best reason to do it is because you reveal that inequality in the wage payments, and it becomes an issue, and hopefully that gets resolved.
And that's also, the patience. Patience is, transparency is not dictating behaviors, but it's influencing behaviors, obviously. Of course, at a moment in time, on taxation, for instance, which you were talking about, you need a political decision on this one. And first of all, I think that it would be quote unquote easy, but if the use of proceeds is also a big issue. You know, what do you do with the taxation? Is it to solve, you know, the greenhouse gas emissions issue, or is it to go in a big budget and blah, blah, blah. But that's a personal view. So you need to solve that. But at the moment, I'm surprised to see the kind of reaction, you know, transparency is going to be difficult because it will make me look not so good. So I believe that transparency is a factor of progress.
In many global companies, the S is a lot about employees, and employees are demanding this kind of information, and they want to work for a firm that does disclose that. Retention of great people needs to have this. So I think, in general, this is definitely a positive, especially for the employees.
And if I may add a point, you know, I'm sorry. If I may add a point, you know, there is something that has not been mentioned today, intangible. Yeah. Because I think it's a key issue. When you have the book value of a company and you compare to market cap, and market cap, it's without the control factor, the premium for control. So you have a huge gap, and the gap is even bigger if you have a change in control. So where does the difference come from? Because when you think about sustainability reporting, you think about externalities that are not priced. So in theory, it's more liabilities, but that would increase the gap. So, you know, I think if sustainability reporting at a point in time is addressing a reasonable level of information on intangibles, I think it would be a great help for the understanding of what big businesses bring or do not bring to society in their value creation mechanisms.
And I will say to your question, the reason why I'm so happy this is a panel on regulation, not on disclosure, but on sort of the regulatory framework around disclosure, is that the only way we solve for the issue you've described, the reticence to disclose because it makes you look bad, is if it's a legal requirement, so it's a level playing field. It's really hard for companies to be first movers because everyone has negative impacts as well as positive. Right, there's a lady over there with a question. So I'm going to come to you next, and then I promise you I'll go to the back and to you.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read some information, and I'd like for everyone to think about it, and I'll have a question afterwards. So earlier we heard about TCFD and how many companies report in accordance with TCFD. So I'm going to read portions of TCFD, which the SEC's regulations are largely based on. I think. Organizations should provide their Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, and if appropriate, Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and the related risks. Greenhouse gas emissions should be calculated in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol methodology to allow for aggregation and comparability across organizations and jurisdictions. For disclosures related to the strategy and metrics and targets recommendations, the task force believes organizations should provide such information in annual financial filings when the information is deemed material. Organizations should describe their processes for managing climate-related risks, including how they make decisions to mitigate, transfer, accept, or control those risks. In addition, organizations should describe their processes for prioritizing climate-related risks, including how materiality determinations are made within their organizations. Next, since we're talking about greenhouse gas protocol, I'm going to fly to the greenhouse gas protocol Scope 3 section. Companies shall account for all Scope 3 emissions and disclose and justify any exclusions. A material misstatement occurs when the individual or aggregate errors, emissions, and misrepresentations have a significant impact on the greenhouse gas inventory results and could influence a user's decision. Next, the Paris Agreement, nowhere in it does it say that Scope 3 emissions are not included. Science does not work. You cannot hit that target without Scope 3. So all of these standards are all focused on TCFD. Yet, hey, all these companies say they are reporting in accordance with it. So we go, we publish the standards. What happens then? We have all these companies in the United States, they're pushing back against the SEC's disclosure drafts, right? They're actually ones that say that they report in accordance with TCFD.
May I suggest that you have a look at E1?
Yeah, do you know, I agree with that. I agree with that. You should have read out that too. Did any of my panelists want to comment? I'm assuming that your question is, why? What is the question?
The question is, we're going to come out with these new standards, but the standards are all based off TCFD, and you see what TCFD states. So how are things going to be any different in the future?
May I quote one point? You know, I'm wondering, Clara, if you were participating to that meeting, by the way. We had a presentation made by the TCFD people following their, you know, and they said to us, it was a joint meeting with the EFRAG and ISSB, and they said, we are not standard setters. We establish a framework, and it's for you, ISSB and EFRAG, to make sure that you cover in line with the framework, or beyond the framework sometimes.
And the consultation drafts are out now, right? So this is the moment to take your anger and respond, because that is what people are asking for.
And Scope 3 is included in E1. I suggest you have a look.
It is, and the standards aren't set yet, and this is the whole point. But Kristina and Sacha, I'd love you to comment if you want.
Yeah, I mean, it's the reason to have rules which will be enforceable. Right now, it's all voluntary, and companies can say what they want to. They can say they're reporting in accordance with the TCFD, and the SEC is not enforcing that, and it's hard for it to enforce that in the absence of just, you know, blatant fraud. But if these disclosure principles are incorporated into the rules, it'll be a lot easier for the SEC to enforce them. And will there be perfect disclosure? No, but we'll certainly get a lot farther down the road than we are now.
And to your point, if I may, I think it wouldn't be unfair to say that due to the framework nature of the TCFD recommendations, there are many ways to implement, and that's why the standards are much needed. I think it's important, because, you know, at the moment you have many people that say, I'm TCFD compliant, but okay, it's a generic way to assess you assess your own compatibility with a framework. And the generic framework, you know, you had also many people that were saying, I'm producing an integrated reporting.
Yeah.
You know, but that's fine, because the principles are good. But, you know, there are many ways to produce an integrated report too, because it's, when you have a look, you're talking about, you know, we are criticized for having produced 400 pages. By the way, the SEC, it's more. And only on one topic. So we have been criticized. But, you know, someone said last week to me, we should tell you that it was a real challenge to limit yourself to 400 pages. Because when you have a look at IFRS on the financial reporting side, extensive. You know, you have books. And at a moment in time, if we want sustainability reporting to be the second pillar of corporate reporting, then the overarching management report, you know, that is explaining the integration of everything, you need to be serious about the way you report.
And I was at the meeting with Patrick, and it was TCFD is not a standard. So just a reminder to everyone, these standards are being consulted on now. So please, please send in your views. We have a lady at the middle back there. There's a gentleman on the left. If you need to leave, please go. And I am going to let questions keep coming if everyone's really engaged until I'm told by the organizers that's not allowed anymore.
Good job.
So.
The light.
Thank you. Vesica Lampier from EBRD, and thank you for this excellent panel. So, a couple of questions to Patrick, if I may. And indeed, the ESRS draft for consultation is just tremendous effort, and it will have a transformational, I think, impact not only on the businesses in Europe, but also everyone who wants to do business in Europe. Now, we are working, so we're covering some of the EU member states, Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and also the kind of broader Central Asian region in North Africa. My question to you, Patrick, is, and this is only from personal experience, what we have seen is, now you mentioned 50,000 companies are expected to report under the new CSRD. So do you think there is the capacity, the knowledge of all of these, or most of these companies? What we have seen in Southern Europe, for example, is there is a tremendous knowledge gap. There is also not sufficient professional services. You mentioned auditors. Are there any thoughts about standards for auditors and basically how these companies will manage within the next couple of years related to that? So in the standards, have you thought of gradually minimum kind of requirements for like small-sized companies moving to, you know, full-blown reporting? So I think this will be a huge challenge. And a bit of a controversial comment, if I may, Kristina. Thank you so much for covering SEC. It's really helpful. What do you think will have to happen for the SEC to consider the social side of the issue, social considerations? Do you think that this kind of in the mid-term horizon? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Kristina. First of all, I forgot to mention the implementation dates that are in the CSRD. The first reporting for the large ones is 2024, published in 2025. Then the other ones, i.e. basically the non-listed ones, it's 1 year later. And for the listed SMEs, it's 1 more year after that. So there was a big discussion about the pace of implementation. In the consultation, we have 2 key questions. Question 1 is, are the disclosures we propose providing relevant information? Because, you know, we are not in a tick-the-box exercise. We are here to give decision useful information to investors and other stakeholders. So, question 1, is it relevant? Question 2, is it too much to start with? So, you know, we can fine-tune the relevance. It can be less or more. It can be improved. But we can also play with the number of phasing-in factors and priorities without compromising with the ultimate goal. So one of the key questions that we are asking is, should we provide optional disclosures to start with? You know, that would become mandatory after a couple of years and things like that, you know. A little bit the core and more approach that was explained by a number of stakeholders.
I'm going to let Kristina answer the other part of your question, and then I'm really sorry, but we actually have to wrap. I'm sure, I'm going to volunteer time here, but I'm sure if there are burning questions, people could come up as we leave.
I'll be super quick. The SEC does have on its agenda to address a couple of social issues. There's a human capital rulemaking project that's underway. The SEC hasn't yet issued proposals, but I expect that it will. And then also a board diversity proposal that is somewhere in the works. So there is a focus on social as well.
Thank you so much, all of you, for coming.